Jean. What a wonderful, warm place to be. I'm always thrilled when I get invited to come in here, and hate to see Patty out of town, but it's just lovely to get that call. Hey, Peter, can you come in and do a Sunday? So thank you, Patty, wherever you are, Florida, New York, or something. So my talk today is called The Third Buddha. And what it's really about is this. What is the best use for religious teachers? What is the best use for these spiritual icons that so many billions of people around the world follow, Jesus, Buddha, etc.? Should we follow them, or should we try to become them? And that's a very simple way of stating a very kind of complicated set of questions. So what is the third Buddha? And what are the first and second Buddhas? That's the next question. We'll get to all that in a minute. But first, just a little primer on Buddhism. I know many of you practice Buddhist practices, have read about it, have studied it. But just in case a couple of you fell through the cracks through the years, let me just sketch in a very quick nutshell what the essential mission and vision of Buddhism is. So Buddhism is the fourth largest religion in the world. For those of you keeping score, the first one is Christianity, numerically, right? The biggest members, about a third of the earth identifies as Christian. The second one is Islam, and it's also the fastest growing. And the third biggest religion in the world is Hinduism, and then comes Buddhism in a distant fourth. So no medal for Buddhism is what I'm thinking about now. Although there may have been some, interference on that last loop. So for 25 centuries, people all over the world have been inspired by the wisdom of this 4th century BC teacher called Siddhartha Gautama, who through his own meditation practice woke up. And as Siddhartha traveled around India and taught for 50 years, quite a bit longer than Jesus' teaching career, which is about 2.5 years, right? So Buddha lived 50 years after this awakening experience and taught all over India. And people asked him, what are you? Are you a guru? Are you a saint? Are you a god? And he would simply answer, I am awake. Now, in Sanskrit, the word for awake is bud, B-U-D-H, bud. So Siddhartha became known as the one who woke up, the Buddha. That's really all it means. So, at the core of this spiritual tradition of Buddhism is this central metaphor that normal everyday consciousness is a kind of sleep, a conditioned state of consciousness that it turns out isn't very conscious at all. So think about it. You're born, you open your eyes, they bring you home, they start raising you. They do their best to kind of teach you everything that they know. Your parents and your siblings and your culture and your values and your friends. And they all impart their understandings of the world into you. I'm sure it's a benign process. We don't want to call it indoctrination. That sounds so nefarious, right? It's all, most people mean well when they try to explain the world to children. And so it isn't sinister, I suppose, but nevertheless, we are kind of lulled into a way of being in the world and a way of seeing the world that may not be, terribly enlightened. People are just passing on their misunderstandings generation after generation. But the good news is, Buddhism holds, the good news is it is possible to wake up from this kind of shared dream. And Buddhism then shows us how. Much like what you heard this morning Reverend Jean say about practical spirituality, the Buddhist path is not a bunch of metaphysical theories about what is. The Buddhist path is primarily a healing modality. It's about how to get better. So Buddha was very keen on not trying to explain everything, but rather giving people tools by which they could shift into a kind of an increasing awareness. So the basic path of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, are this. First, we must acknowledge that life, as it is normally lived, hurts, that it is characterized by suffering and dissatisfaction. And secondly, We must come to understand that our suffering and dissatisfaction have a cause, and that cause, namely, is our own craving and attachments. And third, we must see that if we renounced or let go of these cravings and attachments, our suffering would decrease. And the fourth noble truth is this list of suggested practices called the Eightfold Path. 8 suggestions for changing the way we think and speak and act and work and are in the world. And if we were to follow these suggestions Buddha taught of the Eightfold Path, our self-centeredness, our self-obsession would begin to decrease, thereby decreasing our suffering. And we would move closer toward nirvana, that state of consciousness where the agitation and the fear of the craving state is gradually replaced by the stillness and clarity of insight and wisdom. And then we would be awake. So that's the basic pitch of Buddhism that you get over and over and over again in many forms. So when Buddha died around the age of 80, his students struggled to codify and record Buddha's teachings. And naturally, as you can imagine, if you've ever served on a committee anywhere trying to do anything, disagreements arose about what he said and what it meant. So right away, this happens in Islam, it's all over the Christian story. After the teacher's gone, the divisions immediately arise. And so 2 major groups of Buddhists propped up pretty quick, the Theravada tradition and the Mahayana tradition. And the core question or questions that fueled the dispute, that fueled the dissent, were essentially the ones that we're considering today. Who was the teacher and how should we regard him? Should we emulate his life and embody his teachings, or should we worship and revere him? So as a way of approaching these challenging questions, there's a Mahayana doctrine called Trikaya that I want to share with you today. And it's really at the root of the title of this talk, The Third Buddha. Trikaya, Trikaya. So Sanskrit's really great because it's very much like Greek and Latin. So the first syllable, tri, you recognize from Trinity and triple and all of that. It means 3. Tricycle. So Trikaya means 3 forms. That's all. 3 forms. So in this Mahayana doctrine, the Buddha comes to us in 3 distinct forms. And I know some of you are already thinking about the Trinity in traditional Christianity. There may be a kind of analogous connection there. But I'm going to go a little different direction. So although Buddha nature is a singular reality, it manifests itself, the teaching goes, in these 3 distinct forms. So the first form is called Nirmanakaya, and it is the physical form. This is the flesh and blood man, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived for 80 years, 2,400 years ago in India. We aren't going to meet him. And there's no way to know really anything about him, because a lot of spiritual teachers, as the centuries unfold, this enormous calcification process takes shape. His life is completely hidden from us under thousands of years of mythology. So we can kind of forget about Nirmanakaya or the physical Buddha. The second one, now gets interesting when we get to the second one. The second one is called Sambhogakaya, and that's the spiritual form of the Buddha, or the celestial form that inhabits the celestial realm, where he receives our devotion and answers our prayers. So in Mahayana Buddhism particularly, the Theravadins are doing something very different. That's not our concern today. But the Mahayana Buddhists, many of them become quite devotional in their relationship to Buddha. They believe that after the Buddha died, he took up residence as a spiritual kind of deity-like being in the celestial, and I keep pointing up here, in the celestial realms. And we can pray to him, and he can bestow his grace on us, a very recognizable kind of devotional vibe. So that's the second Buddha. That's the one we would pray to. So the third one, now we're getting to the interesting part. The third form, the third Buddha, is called Dharmakaya. And this is the universal form that permeates all reality, including us. So in this sense, everything that is Buddha nature, is Dharmakaya. So this is a much more encompassing kind of way of conceptualizing Buddha nature. It is the name of being itself, what in Vedanta we would call Brahman. Everything that is material, that is energy, that is consciousness, is a manifestation of this Dharmakaya. So in that sense, we are already unified with Buddha, or with Buddha consciousness. So some of you may remember a book by Deepak Chopra called The Third Jesus. I kind of copped the title for this lesson today from that title, because really Chopra was doing the same thing in his study of Jesus and the Gospels, especially the mystical Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels. So in Chopra's analysis of Jesus, the first Jesus was, that historical Jesus, the man who lived in Nazareth and Jerusalem, and we know very little about him. And the second Jesus, Chopra calls the ecclesiastical Jesus. That's the Jesus that the church has taught us for 2,000 years. Born of a virgin, a miraculous singular being, the incarnation of the one divine Lord, performed all kinds of miracles, the traditional deal. Died and resurrected from the dead, and his death on the cross signifies all of our salvation from our original sin, and all that stuff that we're all very familiar with in mainstream Christianity. That's the second Jesus. So what's the third Jesus? Well, for Chopra, the third Jesus is this limitless mystical being or consciousness with which we already participate. So Jesus, in that third sense, is the one who tried to show us not his divinity, but our divinity. And that's, of course, a heretical teaching in the eyes of traditional Christianity, still connected to the second Jesus. It is blasphemy to claim for myself the characteristics of God in traditional Christianity, to say that I am God. That's what got Jesus killed, of course. And that's what's gotten a lot of people killed. So, but for Chopra, that's precisely the message we have ignored. So, back to Buddhism. Which of these three Buddhas is the most important? Nirmanakaya, the physical Buddha, the guy who lived thousands of years ago. Sambhogakaya, the celestial Buddha, the sort of deity-like figure that some Buddhists pray to. Or Dharmakaya, the universal Buddha, the Buddha nature of all time and space and being and energy and consciousness. Which of those is the most important? The way you answer the question, it profoundly shapes your spiritual life. You'll make a lot of decisions from the way you answer that question. And it just really depends on your temperament, I think, on who you are. Again, that first Buddha is out of reach, but for the more devotional among us, maybe that second Buddha is most appealing. Enormous power, a sacred power above and outside of us, capable of hearing our prayers and offering supernatural assistance. For many people, that's the ticket. To fall on their knees before a power greater than themselves in the hopes of that by cultivating a relationship with this transcendent something, they will be bestowed with grace and they will be lifted out of the quagmire of their suffering. So here we see Buddha in this second orientation as a special being, as an embodiment of divine reality outside of ourselves. But for the more, philosophical or introspective of us, it is the third Buddha that holds sway. The idea that all matter and energy and consciousness is already Buddha nature, and we have only to awaken to this reality. And at this third level, we see Buddha or Jesus not as outside of and superior to us, but as a mirror held up to our own infinite significance. I was at the zoo yesterday. I hadn't been in about 5 years. And my wife and I were walking around, and we're at the ape enclosure, and it was remarkable. There's a 1 year, 8-month-old baby in there right now, and you could sit there and just watch for hours as this baby climbs up on her mother's back, as her mother ambles around and climbs on stuff. And it reminded me of a Japanese Zen Buddhist idea, the way of the cat versus the way of the monkey. How do cats transport their young? How do cats transport their kittens? They grab them by the back of the neck, and the kitten goes limp and just gets kind of carried over here and plopped down. How do baby monkeys get around? They climb on their mother's back or they get left behind. And so in Japanese Zen Buddhism, they use that as a metaphor for your spiritual orientation. The second Buddha are kittens. The third Buddha are monkeys. Are you with me? The second Buddha want to get picked up and carried by the power greater than them outside and carried to heaven or nirvana. But for a lot of us, it's like, you better climb on, or it's just, yourself through your own power. But then you realize your own power, that's sort of a misleading phrase anyway. So in this third Buddha consciousness, we are all Buddhas, only we don't know it. The kingdom of heaven, as Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, the kingdom of heaven is lying all about us, all over the earth, only we do not see it. So in this scenario, the whole dynamic for spiritual growth and spiritual seeking shifts. It turns out there is nothing to seek. There is nothing to seek. Because seeking implies that it isn't here, and I have to go over there to get it, so here I go. But if everything is already one, if everything is already permeated with and at its core identical to Buddha consciousness or Dharmakaya, then why would you have to move an inch? We're already there. There's nothing to seek. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to become. We're already that. So the purpose of our spiritual practice then is not to go somewhere else, but it is to remove the hindrances that prevent us from realizing our intrinsic Buddhahood, or Christ consciousness, as Paul calls it in his letters in the New Testament. As the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart put it, God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by a process of subtraction. So when we awaken to our Dharmakaya, the third Buddha, when we correctly see the interdependency and interconnectedness of all things, we come to see that there are no fixed, separate things. Everything, all phenomena, arise interdependently, concomitantly. Nothing is the cause of itself, and nothing exists in isolation. This is what unity finally means. You cannot, if you're hiking in the woods along a river, and you come upon a whirlpool where the river kind of takes a bend and there's a spiral of water kind of pulling down, a whirlpool, you cannot pick up that whirlpool and say, I'm going to take that home and put it in my truck and take it home and put it in my yard because it's so pretty. A whirlpool is not a thing. And you can feel how the language tricks us. English is a language built on nouns. The Navajo language, for example, is almost completely and entirely noun-free. Everything is a verb. They wouldn't call it a whirlpool, they'd call it a whirlpooling. It's different, isn't it? Because when you call everything in the world a noun, you sort of fall asleep into the illusion that reality is all these fixed and intact and disconnected and alienated separate things, atomized. But in fact, a whirlpool isn't really a thing, it's an event. It's a happening. It isn't a noun, it's a verb. It's a whirlpooling. And in fact, it isn't separate from the river, or we should call it the rivering. There's a bunch of water going down a low spot, and that's a rivering, and once in a while it whirlpoolings. And all of that comes from the streamings, that come from the raining, that come from the clouding, that arise out of the oceaning. And the oceaning comes from the riverings that are pouring into the oceaning. And there's no beginning. You can't trace anything back to an origin. I'm so sick of talking about who caused ISIS. You can't, Nietzsche warns us about this. You cannot find the origin of anything because everything is caused by everything else concomitantly. The universe is arising. It's a phenomenal field of interconnected events. So in this view then of non-duality or oneness, everything is an event. Life is a verb, not a noun. So in the knowledge of this sort of expanded consciousness, I am no longer Peter Bolland, despite your marvelous introduction. I am Peter Bollanding. I am the universe Peter Bollanding for a while. So this is the ocean, and each of us is a little wave on top of the ocean. Someone took me and my wife sailing a couple of weekends ago, and I remembered why I do it so rarely. It's like riding a bucking bronco all day long. They're trying to serve food. It's like, why bother? It's just flying all over the place. Everyone's like vaguely, like, when do we get back to the land, you know? So God bless all you sailors. I'm an embarrassment to my Dutch tradition because we're supposed to be ocean-going people. I like surfing because you're really close to the beach there. But once you leave San Diego Bay and you're out in the water, like, why? Why? So all those waves out there, we're all waves on the surface of this one thing called Brahman or Dharmakaya. I'm over here rising up, you're over there. We are all the one waving. And when we come to this deeper understanding of Buddha nature or Christ consciousness, we are liberated from the narrow, limited view that we are this body, this surface mind, this temporary form. Because as Buddha taught, all forms arise and all forms fade. But Dharmakaya, the Buddha nature, is the frame in which all of these achingly beautiful forms arise and fade. And when you fall in love with a puppy or a person or anything, you make a deal and you say, this form that I've fallen in love with is temporal. It will die. But in that love experience, something of the eternal breaks through the temporal. And that, as we all say, the love never dies. And as we all say at the end of things, love is the only reality there is. What if love is just another word for the Dharmakaya, the oneness? What if love is what reality tastes like, feels like? So this is why one of my favorite contemporary teachers, Adyashanti, this is why he says, there are no enlightened persons. There's only enlightenment. And when enlightenment happens, there's no one there to claim it. There are no enlightened persons. There is only enlightenment. And when enlightenment happens, there's no one there to claim it. There's just the experience. So beware of teachers who go around saying, I'm enlightened, and I'm going to sell it to you for $1,500 at my 3-day seminar. Unless it's me. But no. I really love that because claiming enlightenment is always sort of creepy. I'm in this business for a long time. I talk about Buddhism and enlightenment and awakening everywhere I go, and once in a while someone has the guts to ask me, so are you enlightened? And I just turn red, and I'm like, I don't know. Of course not. I'm up at 3 a.m. worrying about everything just like everybody else for no reason. But I still like that idea that awakening is what we finally are. So now, we will continue to brush our teeth and show up at work and pay our taxes and so on, even if we have this deepening vision. But now we have one foot in eternity. And from this God consciousness, we more maturely, I think, we more ably, we more elegantly and more lovingly navigate the battlefields of our lives. The plumbing disasters. Now you're walking through your hardwood floored house one morning barefoot and you feel a hot spot. You're like, why the hell is my hardwood floor hot right here? And you go, the slab plumbing burst. There's hot water underneath my hardwood floor. And all of a sudden it all comes to you, dudes with jackhammers in your living room going, you're like, jing and jing. This is going to cost an unbelievable amount of money. Where's my Dharmakaya now? I'm just terror and money anxiety and why did we buy a house? I wish I lived in a van down by the river. Those guys have it so easy. But with one foot in eternity, one foot in Christ consciousness, one foot in the kingdom of heaven, one foot in Dharmakaya, and the other foot in the battlefield, you've got a shot at moving through the struggles of your life with a modicum of elegance and grace and compassion. You don't see enemies, and all of that. So that's what this is, When you begin to move into this dawning, awakening, everyone we meet, every challenge, every setback, every opportunity is a precious unfolding of this miraculous, unified, illumined reality called Dharmakaya, where every form arises and fades, including your slab plumbing. That's a form that arises and fades. So this is what it means then to awaken, I think. To come out of the fog of confusion and claim our rightful place in the clarity of this present moment. We are in the kingdom of heaven. We never left. We only dozed off for a little while and forgot where we were. And so following Buddha or following Jesus or following Muhammad is a great beginning. But now we have to be willing to take the next step to become who we have always been. Buddha nature, Christ consciousness, Jedi warrior, whatever mythological framework moves you, whatever you want to call it. So it's not enough to follow the path forged by another. The great Japanese poet Basho said, don't seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise men of old. Instead, seek what they sought. Climb up on the back of the gorilla by yourself instead of waiting to be carried like a kitten. Maybe it's not enough to worship at the throne of someone else who had this spiritual realization thousands of years ago. Maybe it's not enough even to imitate their behavior. As the Japanese Dominican priest Father Roshida put it, we are not called to be like Christ, but to be Christ. So the third Buddha is us. So let me close with this. Like mystics the world over, the Sufis of the Islamic tradition, the Sufis knew all of this. And they lived there and they had their being there. So I want to close with a poem from one of my favorite Sufi poets, Hafiz. It's called I Have Learned So Much. I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew. The truth has shared so much of itself with me that I can no longer call myself a man, a woman, an angel, or even a pure soul. Love has befriended Hafiz so completely, it has turned to ash and freed me of every concept and image my mind has ever known. Namaste, everybody. Thank you.